At my sister's wedding reception, the massive screen above the dance floor lit up with giant letters: infertile, divorced, failure, high school dropout, broke, alone. The room erupted in laughter. My sister smirked into the microphone and said not to laugh too hard because I might actually cry. My mother swirled her expensive wine. My father smiled and called it just a joke. I reached for my phone, typed one word, and hit send. Begin. The room went dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. My name is Nia, and I am 32 years old. I was sitting on a plush emerald green velvet sofa in my penthouse, looking out over the Atlanta skyline, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, when I finally processed how completely my life had changed. But to understand the peace I have now, you have to understand the absolute chaos of that night at the country club. The reception was dripping in forced elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung low over tables covered in white orchids, all paid for to maintain the facade of our family's flawless social standing. My father, Reverend Thomas, sat at the head table looking like the king of Atlanta. My mother, Vivian, sat beside him, her pearls gleaming as she nodded to her prominent sorority sisters. And then there was Chloe, my 28-year-old sister, the golden child of the family, standing in her custom designer gown next to her new husband, Preston. Preston was 34, white, and wore his family name like a shield. He came from supposedly old money, the kind of generational wealth that made my parents overlook his constant subtle disrespect. When the lights dimmed for Chloe's highly anticipated sisterly tribute video, I expected the usual passive-aggressive jabs. I did not expect a public execution. The slideshow started with photos of us as kids, but quickly shifted. The upbeat music scratched to a halt, replaced by a circus clown soundtrack. Photos of my old apartment, my divorce papers, and my high school records flashed across the 80-inch screen. Then came the words, huge and glaring: infertile, divorced, failure, high school dropout, broke, alone. The laughter started at the head table. Preston threw his head back and laughed loudly, leaning into the microphone to whisper that the apple certainly fell far from the tree in this family. His country club buddies at table 4 howled, raising their glasses. Chloe wiped a fake tear from her eye, looking out at the crowd of 400 guests. "Do not laugh too hard, everybody." Chloe purred into the microphone, her voice dripping with venom. "Nia might actually cry, and her dress looks like it came from a discount rack anyway. We do not want to ruin the cheap fabric with tears." I sat at table 19, the one positioned near the kitchen doors, completely still. I did not cry. I just took a slow sip of my water. My mother, Vivian, caught my eye from the head table. Instead of stopping the humiliation, she simply swirled her wine, her expression silently warning me not to ruin their perfect night. My father smiled a pastoral, forgiving smile and told the crowd over the speakers that it was just a joke, sweetheart, a little family roast to keep us humble. Preston grabbed the microphone from Chloe, his face flushed with champagne and arrogance. He looked right at me, his smile tight and condescending. "Look, Nia, we know it must be tough. My family comes from a long line of wealth, and we know your kind often struggles with jealousy when confronted with real success. But maybe if you had not dropped out of high school, you could afford a plate at this dinner. We basically sponsored your meal tonight." I placed my glass down on the white tablecloth. The clink sounded unusually loud in the echoing ballroom. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk dress. The room quieted down just a fraction, people eager to see the broke sister make a scene. "I did not drop out because I was not smart, Preston," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room without needing a microphone. "I left because my mother drained my entire college savings account to pay for Chloe's luxury car and her sorority dues. And when I confronted them about the theft, my father threw me out on the street with $100 and told me I was a disgrace to his church." Vivian gasped loudly, nearly dropping her wine glass. "Nia, you shut your mouth this instant," she hissed, her pristine image cracking. "You are making a fool of yourself. We kicked you out because you were a lazy delinquent who refused to uphold the family standards. Preston is a brilliant investor from a respected lineage. You should be thanking him on your knees for allowing you into this venue. Preston smirked, crossing his arms over his expensive tuxedo. Do not bother Vivian, he sneered. She is just a bitter woman who cannot handle the fact that my family paid $200,000 for this wedding. She will never see that kind of money in her lifetime. That was the exact moment I reached into my designer bag, pulled out my phone, and opened a secure encrypted messaging app. My security team and data analysts were standing by. I looked right into Preston's smug, arrogant eyes. I typed one single word. Begin. I hit send. I did not need to say another word. Within 3 seconds, the circus music abruptly cut off. The giant screen above the dance floor glitched, flashing violently before turning a deep, blinding red. The room went dead silent. Chloe turned around. Her mouth dropped open and the true chaos instantly began. Preston's face morphed from a portrait of aristocratic arrogance into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The red glare from the 80-inch screen washed over his pale skin, illuminating the pitiful $12.43 displayed next to his prestigious family name. For a split second, the silence in the ballroom was so absolute you could hear the ice clinking in the crystal glasses. Then Preston snapped. He abandoned Chloe at the center of the dance floor, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble as he sprinted toward the DJ booth. "Turn it off," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation that completely shattered his refined Southern gentleman persona. "I said pull the plug right now." The DJ, a young guy hired for his trendy playlists rather than his crisis management skills, fumbled frantically with the soundboard. The screen flickered, but my lead data engineer had already locked the system remotely. The damning bank statements remained frozen above the crowd, shining like a neon sign in the dark. Preston wheeled around to face me. The polite, measured mask he had worn for the past 2 years was entirely gone, replaced by a vicious sneer. He stormed toward my table, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He stopped just inches from where I sat, comfortably sipping my sparkling water. "Are you out of your mind?" Preston spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You really thought you could pull a cheap stunt like this to embarrass me? This is exactly what I expect from your kind. You people are always so bitter, always trying to tear down generational wealth, because you lack the pedigree to build it yourselves. You are nothing but a jealous, uneducated thug playing with Photoshop to cope with your own miserable reality." A collective gasp rippled through the guests closest to our table. Even some of his country club friends shifted uncomfortably at the blatant racial microaggression. But I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my crystal glass on the table and looked up at him with a gaze cold enough to freeze summer rain. "Generational wealth," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue slowly. "That is a fascinating term for a man who had his credit cards declined at a gas station last Tuesday." Preston took a sudden step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the crowd before locking back onto me. "Shut your mouth," he hissed, glancing nervously at my parents. "Richard, Vivian, get this lunatic out of here before I call the police. My family paid $200,000 for this wedding. We deserve respect." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed across the quiet ballroom. "Your family?" I asked, standing up slowly. I smoothed the front of my dress, commanding the space without needing to shout. "Preston, your grandfather built a lumber empire, yes. But your father drank away the profits, and your family trust officially ran dry 3 years ago. In fact, your own mother legally disowned you after you tried to secretly mortgage her summer home in Charleston." "That is a lie," Preston shouted, though a bead of sweat was now visibly rolling down his temple. "You are a psychotic, jealous liar." I snapped my fingers. The massive screen above the dance floor shifted instantly. The bank statements disappeared, replaced by a highly detailed loan agreement from a notorious offshore lending firm. The bold text at the top clearly displayed Preston's full legal name alongside a staggering interest rate. "That $200,000 did not come from your non-existent trust fund, Preston," I said, my voice projecting clearly so every single guest could hear the exact price of his deception. You took out a shadow loan from Apex Financial, a high-risk predatory lender known for breaking legs when their clients default. You borrowed $250,000 at a 42% interest rate just to buy your way into my family and pretend you still belong in high society. The whispers erupted like a wildfire across the ballroom. Chloe's sorority sisters began murmuring behind their hands. The elite church elders my father was so desperate to impress stared at the screen in absolute shock. Preston stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the undeniable proof of his financial ruin hovered above him for all of Atlanta to see. You thought you could marry into a prominent black family to save your sinking ship? I continued, taking a deliberate step toward him. You thought my parents were so desperate for a white son-in-law with a recognized last name that they would never bother to run a basic background check. And you were right about them. But you forgot about me. Preston's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged forward, raising his hand as if he were actually going to strike me right there in front of 400 witnesses. You worthless piece of trash. He growled, the last remnants of his fake charm dissolving into pure hostility. I will destroy you. I will have my real lawyers sue you into the ground until you are begging on the streets. Before he could take another step, two massive men in dark tailored suits materialized from the shadows, stepping seamlessly between Preston and myself. My private security detail had been waiting quietly near the kitchen doors all evening. One of the guards simply placed a massive hand on Preston's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. Preston looked up at the guard, suddenly realizing he was entirely out of his depth. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The golden boy of the evening had just been exposed as a broke, desperate fraud. I expected Chloe to scream at him. I expected my father to demand an explanation. But the toxic dynamic of my family never failed to disappoint me in the most twisted ways possible. Instead of turning on the man who had just lied to her entire family and insulted her own flesh and blood, my mother, Vivian sprang into action. She practically shoved her way through the crowd, her heavy pearl necklace bouncing against her chest as she rushed toward the center of the conflict. But she did not go to Preston. She marched directly toward me. Nia, you stop this disgusting ghetto behavior right now, Vivian screamed, her perfectly manicured hands trembling with misdirected fury. She placed herself protectively in front of Preston, shielding the con artist from my gaze. You are ruining your sister's wedding with these fabricated, jealous lies. Preston is a brilliant investor. His family is American royalty. Security, remove this woman immediately before she ruins our social standing in this very city. The security guards stood like statues carved from granite, completely ignoring my mother's shrill commands. They were loyal only to my payroll, and Vivian's face twisted in absolute indignation when she realized her perceived authority meant absolutely nothing here. She was a woman who was used to demanding total obedience, especially within the velvet-lined walls of this country club, a place she treated like her personal kingdom. Her hand flew to her signature double-strand pearl necklace, her fingers gripping the jewels so tightly, her knuckles turned white, as if the pearls themselves could protect her from the reality of the situation rapidly unfolding around her. Did you not hear me? Vivian shrieked at the guards, her voice losing its polished high society cadence and pitching into something desperate and harsh. I am a founding member of this club. I demand that you remove this woman. I want this bitter ghetto behavior out of my daughter's wedding venue right this instant. I signaled my lead guard to step back just an inch, giving myself the physical room to step forward. I towered over her in my heels, the power dynamic shifting so violently I could almost feel the air pressure drop in the opulent ballroom. Ghetto behavior. Mother, I asked, my tone deadly calm, slicing through her hysteria like a blade. Is that what we are calling it, when someone finally turns on the harsh lights and exposes the cockroaches scattering in the dark? Vivian scoffed, looking me up and down with a mask of absolute disgust, trying desperately to rally the support of her wealthy friends watching from the sidelines. She turned to the crowd, forcing a tight, panicked smile before snapping her attention back to me. You are having a severe psychotic break, Nia. You have been jealous of your sister since you were children. You are just bitter because Chloe married into a prominent family and you ended up a broke, divorced high school dropout who could not even handle the pressure of basic academia. You failed at everything you ever touched and now you want to drag us down to your miserable, pathetic level. The sheer audacity of her lies fueled the fire burning in my chest, a fire I had kept contained for over a decade. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice. The unvarnished truth was heavy enough to crush her without any added volume. I did not drop out of school because I could not handle academia. Mother, I said, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the stunned guests sitting at the tables surrounding the dance floor. I was an honors student taking advanced placement classes. I was tutoring my peers. I had early acceptance letters from 3 different state universities sitting on my desk. Vivian crossed her arms, rolling her eyes in a theatrical display of maternal exhaustion. Delusions. You stopped going to classes because you were lazy and wanted to hang out with the wrong crowd. I stopped going to classes because my tuition check bounced. I countered, taking another deliberate step forward, forcing her to stumble back toward the head table. I stopped going because when I went to the bank to check the college fund I had been depositing my part-time waitress earnings into for 4 grueling years, the teller looked me in the eye and told me the account was completely empty. Chloe, who had been hiding behind Preston's frozen frame, suddenly peeked out, her perfectly contoured face draining of all color. She knew exactly where this conversation was going, and the fake tears on her cheeks dried up instantly. I worked 30-hour weeks on top of my rigorous high school schedule. I continued, my eyes locked dead onto Vivian's terrified gaze. I scrubbed floors, I served food to people just like you, and I saved $45,000. It was my ticket out. And the day before my tuition was due, you walked into that bank branch downtown and drained every single penny. That was family money. Vivian snapped, her voice defensive but wavering significantly as the surrounding guests began to whisper and point. The elite women she played tennis with were now staring at her in horror. I am your mother. What is yours is mine. The family was going through a difficult financial transition, and we needed those funds for emergency household expenses. Household expenses. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made a few guests flinch. Is that what you call Chloe's brand new BMW convertible? Because I distinctly remember her driving that car into the driveway the exact same week my bank account hit zero. I remember you throwing a lavish catered party to celebrate her acceptance into your prestigious sorority, paying her exorbitant membership dues in cash, while I was sitting in my bedroom, trying to figure out how to afford a bus pass to get to my second job just to buy groceries. My father, Reverend Thomas, finally stepped out from behind the bridal table, trying to use his booming authoritative pastor voice to regain control of his crumbling flock. Nia, that is enough. We have apologized for that financial misunderstanding years ago. You are twisting private family matters to make yourself look like a victim in front of these good people. Your mother had joint access to that account. She did nothing illegal, and you know it. Joint access. I tilted my head, looking at my father with a mixture of pity and disgust. Is that the lie she told you, Dad? That she had joint access? Or did you just choose to look the other way because it kept your favorite daughter happy? I reached into my designer bag and pulled out my phone again. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the frantic whispering of the country club manager talking into his radio in the corner. I did not even look at the screen as my thumb hit the command to trigger the next file in my presentation. I was 18 years old, I said, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the room. That account was legally in my name only. My mother did not have joint access. She had something much more creative. Above us, the massive screen shifted instantly from Preston's disastrous shadow loan documents to a highly magnified, high-resolution scan of a bank wire transfer authorization form dated exactly 14 years ago. The murmurs in the room escalated into outright scandalized gasps. Take a very close look at that signature, Mother, I instructed, pointing up at the glowing screen. And take a particularly close look at the attached photocopy of the identification card used to authorize that massive transfer. Vivian gasped loudly, a choking, desperate sound, her hand flying to cover her mouth as she stumbled backward into a chair. On the massive 80-inch display, crisp and clear for every prominent socialite, church elder, and family friend to scrutinize, was a wire transfer document draining $45,000 from my teenage account. Right next to it was a heavily doctored fake state identification card. It had my name, my birth date, and my home address, but the photograph on the ID was a very clear, slightly younger picture of Vivian herself. "You did not just borrow family money to pay for Chloe's luxury lifestyle," I stated, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the ballroom. "You committed first-degree felony identity theft and bank fraud to steal your teenage daughter's life savings." The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was a physical wave of shock. Several prominent women in the front row physically recoiled from my mother, their hands flying to their chests. Vivian stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the velvet chair, her face completely drained of its haughty color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a strained, high-pitched sound of absolute panic. The undeniable high-definition proof of her felony was glaring down at everyone, illuminating her perfectly contoured face in a harsh, red light. For a brief, glorious second, the illusion of my flawless family was completely shattered. But a golden child never lets the spotlight shift for long, especially not on her wedding day. Chloe, who had been shrinking behind Preston, suddenly thrust herself forward. The sheer panic in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. Her face crumpled, her bottom lip began to quiver, and she let out a piercing, devastated sob that echoed across the crystal centerpieces. She grabbed the skirt of her custom silk wedding gown, stepping over to my mother and wrapping her arms around Vivian in a desperate, protective embrace. She cried loudly, her shoulders heaving with the effort. It was the exact same performance she had used since we were little girls, to get out of trouble, to steal the attention, to ensure I was always the one painted as the villain. But tonight, the stakes were millions of dollars, and her precious social standing. "You are a monster!" Nia, Chloe screamed, her voice cracking perfectly with manufactured heartbreak. She turned her tear-streaked face toward the crowd, ensuring every wealthy guest, every church elder, and every sorority sister could see her playing the absolute victim. "Look at what you are doing to our mother. Look at what you are doing to my perfect day. You are sick. You are deeply mentally sick." I did not move. I just watched her perform, my expression entirely neutral. "You forged those documents!" Chloe wailed, pointing a trembling diamond-adorned finger at me. "You paid someone to fake that bank transfer because you are so consumed with jealousy that you cannot stand to see me happy. You have always hated me because I got the life you so desperately wanted and failed to achieve." The crowd began to murmur again. Chloe's tears were powerful. She was a beautiful bride in distress, and high society always loved a damsel. A few of Vivian's friends nodded sympathetically, wanting desperately to believe that the scandal on the screen was a malicious hoax rather than the ugly truth about their tennis partner. "You are projecting, Chloe," I said softly, picking up my crystal glass of sparkling water from the table. "I am projecting," Chloe shrieked, letting go of our mother and marching toward the center of the dance floor. She was completely unhinged now, desperate to shift the narrative back to my supposed failures. "You are a bitter, empty woman, Nia. You are so miserable in your own pathetic existence that you had to come here and try to destroy my husband and my family. But everyone here knows the truth about you. Everyone saw the real slideshow." She paced back and forth, the heavy silk of her train dragging across the polished wood. "You want to talk about fraud?" she yelled, gesturing wildly. "Let us talk about your marriage. Let us talk about how your husband ran out on you because you were a cold, broken wife. You want to act like you are so superior standing there in your cheap dress, but you are nothing but a barren, lonely failure." The room grew so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Even Preston looked slightly uncomfortable at the sheer viciousness of her attack. But Chloe was fueled by adrenaline and desperation, determined to completely assassinate my character in front of Atlanta's elite, so no one would believe the financial crimes flashing above her head. "You are empty inside," Chloe screamed, stepping right up to the edge of my table. Her face twisted with a cruelty that entirely ruined her bridal beauty. "That is why you are doing this. You want to ruin my marriage because you could not even keep a man or give him a child." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. She had used the most painful private parts of my past as a weapon, throwing my supposed infertility and my painful divorce into the faces of 400 strangers just to save her own skin. Several guests gasped, looking at me with overwhelming pity. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to run out of the ballroom in tears, thoroughly humiliated by the golden child who had just struck the ultimate low blow. I did not crumble. I did not cry. I looked at my sister, taking in her red, blotchy face and her desperate, calculating eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for her anymore. The last remaining shred of sisterly affection I had been holding on to simply evaporated into the cold air of the ballroom. I lifted my crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, casual sip of my sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the rim. I lowered the glass, giving Chloe a smile so serene, so chillingly calm, that her own fake tears instantly stopped. I looked past her, raising my left hand and giving a subtle two-finger signal to my lead security guard standing near the DJ booth. The screen above the dance floor instantly went black. The red glow vanished, plunging the room into normal lighting. For 1 second, Chloe looked triumphant, thinking her cruel outburst had actually forced me to surrender. She took a deep breath, preparing to deliver her final victorious remark. Before she could open her mouth, a sharp click echoed through the venue's massive surround sound speakers. The DJ booth had been completely bypassed. An audio file began to play crystal clear and booming across the silent, breathless room. The room was a pressure cooker of whispered gossip and frantic energy. Vivian was still hovering, her face a mask of frantic socialite-saving panic. Chloe, however, had gone deathly pale, her eyes darting between the black screen and the silent, expectant faces of our guests. She knew exactly what that audio file contained. She opened her mouth to interrupt, to scream, to create any kind of noise to drown out the coming silence, but the speakers crackled to life before she could breathe a word. My voice came through the sound system, but it was younger, softer, and laced with a grief I hadn't felt in half a decade. I didn't reach for the microphone. I simply stood there, my posture perfect, my gaze locked on my sister's rapidly disintegrating composure. I let the room listen to the truth. The audio wasn't just a recording, it was a testament to the night I burned my old life to the ground. 5 years ago, I hadn't been the failure they painted. I had been a woman who had finally opened her eyes. I had been married to a man who promised me the world, a man my parents had practically handpicked for his status and his connection to their church board. I had been happy, or so I thought. Then came the night I found them. The audio file played the muffled sounds of a bedroom door opening, the sharp intake of breath, and then the devastating, intimate conversation that followed. The voice of my ex-husband Mark was distinct, but it was the voice responding to him that made the ballroom go deathly, hauntingly still. It was Chloe's voice. It was my baby sister giggling, whispering secrets about how much she hated the way I dressed, how she deserved a man of his stature, how she had been waiting for the right moment to take him from me because I didn't appreciate what I had. I waited until the file reached the crescendo of their betrayal before I took the microphone from the stand. My voice was smooth, devoid of the shaking vulnerability I had lived with for years. You all heard the slideshow, I said, my voice projecting with the cold precision of a judge. You heard them call me infertile. You heard them call me a failure because I couldn't keep a man or produce a grandchild for the Wilson legacy. I turned to look at Vivian, who had retreated into a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched a lace handkerchief. I am not infertile, Mother. I never was. The truth is much simpler. 5 years ago, when I discovered that my husband and my own sister were sharing a bed while I was at work, I made a choice. I didn't have a child to save that marriage because I knew even then that a child shouldn't be born into a home built on deceit and treachery. I chose to have a bilateral tubal ligation. I chose to ensure that I would never, under any circumstances, be permanently tethered to a man who could violate our vows with the person who was supposed to be my best friend. I walked toward Chloe, who was now clutching the edge of the head table as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. The high society guests were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at Chloe and Vivian with an intensity that bordered on disgust. "You wanted a narrative, Chloe?" I continued, my voice low and intimate, meant only for her ears, yet amplified for every person in the room to hear. "You wanted a story where I was the pathetic broken sister so you could shine brighter in your stolen life. You told everyone at church that I was cursed, that God had closed my womb because I was a rebel. But the only thing broken in this family was your morality. I didn't lose the ability to have children. I exercised the agency to protect my future from your poison." The room was a vacuum of sound. No one dared to breathe. My father's face was a mottled purple, his hands gripping his wine glass so tightly I expected it to shatter. Vivian was staring at the floor, the Duyen Mao 1_7.Doc_X protocol she had relied on for years to manipulate the family narrative had been shredded. She had banked everything on the idea that I would be too ashamed to speak, too broken to defend myself. She had miscalculated everything. "You want to talk about failure, Chloe?" I said, finally turning to face the entire room. "You want to talk about being socially unfit? Look around you. You built this wedding on a foundation of stolen money, a fraudulent trust, and a husband who took out shadow loans to pay for your dress. You built your life on the ruins of mine." I looked at the guests, at the faces of people who had spent decades looking down on me while I worked in silence. "I am not the failure," I said, my voice rising. "I am the woman who left the debris behind. I didn't drop out of life. I dropped out of your control. And if being barren means that I won't raise a child to be as deceitful and cruel as the two of you, then call it whatever you want. To me, it is the only honest thing I have ever done." I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I didn't wait for my father to try and offer some hollow prayer to cover the cracks. I turned my back on the head table, the emerald velvet of the sofa, and the warmth of the penthouse feeling miles away, but I knew I had already won. I had stripped them of their favorite weapon. The infertile lie was dead. And the woman who had walked into this club seeking a reconciliation with her sister had died right along with it. In her place stood someone they no longer knew how to touch. "Mark, you have to pick up the phone. It is me. You cannot keep ignoring my calls. You promised." The voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers was undeniably Chloe's. It was not the sweet, demure, innocent tone she had been projecting all evening for her high society in-laws. This voice was whiny, desperate, calculating, and laced with a toxic urgency. "You promised you were going to tell Nia tonight." The recording continued, the audio quality so crisp that every frantic breath she took was audible. "You promised me you were going to leave her. I cannot stand seeing you play house with her anymore. She is so boring, Mark. She is completely frigid. You said so yourself. You said you only married her because she was safe, and our parents loved you together. Well, I am not safe. I am exactly what you need. Just pack your things and leave. Let her have her stupid little design career and her boring life. We belong together. Call me back the second she leaves for work. I am waiting for you." A sharp click signaled the end of the voicemail, dropping the ballroom back into a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the chest of every person present. The visual shift in the room was violent and immediate, like a tracking shot moving rapidly across a scene of absolute devastation. The collective inhale of 400 people sounded like a vacuum sealing the space. Chloe's sorority sisters, the ones in the matching blush bridesmaid gowns, who had been fawning over her perfection just an hour ago, were literally covering their mouths in horror. One of them actually dropped her champagne flute. The delicate glass shattered against the polished marble floor with a sharp crack that underscored the unbearable tension. The elite church ladies, the very women Vivian had spent years courting, manipulating, and trying to impress, were staring at the bridal table with expressions of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The pristine, untouched image of the virgin bride, the perfect Christian daughter, was completely incinerated in less than 40 seconds of recorded audio. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the dance floor. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish suffocating on dry land. The color had entirely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow beneath her heavy bridal makeup. The sudden realization that her carefully crafted image of innocence was permanently obliterated seemed to short-circuit her brain. She looked frantically toward the DJ booth, waving her arms in a jerky, uncoordinated motion. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. "That is not me. That is altered. She faked that. She used a computer to fake my voice. But nobody was buying it. The audio was too raw, too specific, too perfectly matched to the exact cadence and inflection of her voice. She had used the most painful private parts of my past as a weapon, throwing my supposed infertility and my painful divorce into the faces of strangers, only for the truth to expose her as the architect of that very pain. I turned my gaze to Preston, expecting to see a groom heartbroken by the revelation that his new wife was a treacherous homewrecker. Instead, I saw something much more sinister. Preston's face was contoured with pure venomous rage, but his eyes were not locked on Chloe or me. They were locked on the crowd. He was scanning the room, looking at his country club peers, the wealthy investors he had desperately been trying to impress, the prominent families, who now knew he was both a financial fraud and a cuckolded fool who had married into a family of thieves and liars. Preston was not disgusted by Chloe's lack of morals. He was utterly disgusted by the public humiliation she had just draped over his shoulders. His pristine, aristocratic Southern gentleman facade melted away entirely, revealing the desperate, vicious man underneath. The man who borrowed money from shadow lenders was now watching his social capital burn to ashes. "You stupid, careless little girl," Preston hissed, his voice dropping into a guttural sneer that carried perfectly in the dead silent room. Chloe flinched, reaching a trembling hand toward him, her fake tears entirely gone now, replaced by genuine panic. "Preston, baby, please. You have to believe me. It is a lie. She is just trying to ruin us because she is jealous." Preston did not offer comfort. Instead, he stepped forward and grabbed Chloe's arm with a violent, aggressive jerk. His fingers dug deeply into her bare bicep, pulling her roughly toward him. The sudden physical aggression caused several guests to gasp again, this time in genuine alarm. The romantic illusion of the newlyweds was gone, replaced by a toxic display of hostility. "You embarrassed me," Preston growled, giving her arm another harsh shake, ignoring her whimper of pain. "I put up with your insufferable, tacky family to secure my standing, and you let this bitter woman humiliate me in front of the entire city. You are an absolute liability. Let go of her." "Preston," my father suddenly boomed, finally finding his voice, though he remained firmly planted behind the safety of the head table, making no move to physically protect his favorite daughter. Preston ignored him. His eyes snapped toward me, and the fury in his expression was completely unhinged. He dropped Chloe's arm, letting her stumble backward into Vivian, and took a menacing heavy step in my direction. He needed a target for his rage, someone to punish for the utter destruction of his master plan, and I was standing right in front of him. "You think you won?" Preston shouted, his fists balled at his sides, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. "You think you can humiliate me, ruin my name, and just walk out of here? I am going to make you pay for every single word you just broadcasted. I am going to tear you apart." He lunged forward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble as he closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. The guests closest to me screamed, scrambling backward in a frantic wave of silk and taffeta to get out of the way of his violent outburst. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply held my ground, casually taking another sip from my crystal glass, my eyes locked on his approaching frame. Before Preston could cross the final 10 feet, the shadows surrounding the perimeter of the ballroom seemed to peel away. The heavy velvet curtains and the dark alcoves near the exits suddenly yielded movement. 6 heavily armed private security guards materialized with terrifying synchronization. They did not just step out. They moved with the tactical precision of a military unit. Dressed in immaculate black tactical gear, beneath tailored suit jackets, their earpieces glowing faintly, they moved in perfect formation. Within a fraction of the second, they had completely surrounded me in a tight, impenetrable semicircle of muscle and weaponry. The lead guard, a mountain of a man with a stern, unyielding expression, stepped directly into Preston's path. He did not draw a weapon, but he didn't need to. He placed a massive gloved hand squarely on Preston's chest, stopping the furious charging groom dead in his tracks with the force of a brick wall. Preston slammed into the guard's hand and bounced back, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he took in the sheer size and the heavily armed nature of the men now forming a human shield around me. Preston staggered backward, his highly polished shoes losing their grip on the dance floor as he collided heavily with a vacant cocktail table. A tower of champagne flutes crashed to the marble with a deafening shatter, raining glass around his ankles. He looked like a cornered animal, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically from the impassive face of my lead security guard to the tactical holsters secured at the men's waists. The bravado that had fueled his charge vanished entirely, replaced by the stark, humiliating realization that he was completely powerless. He raised his hands in a jerky defensive gesture and took another stumbling step away, his gaze finally dropping to the floor. The physical geometry of the room felt violently distorted, a jarring, tilted perspective where the supposed elites of Atlanta were entirely stripped of their authority. The silence following the breaking glass was heavy and suffocating. No one moved to help Preston. No one moved to comfort Chloe, who was now openly weeping onto the emerald velvet of a lounge chair, the audio recording of her treachery still ringing in everyone's ears. That was when the patriarch finally decided to descend from his throne. Reverend Thomas pushed his way past the trembling catering staff, stepping onto the dance floor with heavy, deliberate strides. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. For 30 years, my father had cultivated the image of the perfect, untouchable megachurch pastor. He commanded a congregation of 10,000 every Sunday, authored best-selling books on family values, and sat on boards that dictated the moral compass of the city. To have his pristine, highly lucrative reputation shredded in front of his most prominent church elders and financial backers was an offense he could not tolerate. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at the shattered glass. He marched directly toward my wall of security, stopping just inches from where Preston had failed. Nia Antoinette Thomas, my father boomed, projecting his voice from deep within his chest. It was his pulpit voice, the rich, commanding baritone designed to rattle stained glass windows and demand total obedience from his flock. You will call off these hired thugs right this instant. You are making a mockery of this holy union and turning this sacred celebration into a common street brawl. I demand respect in this room. I did not signal the guards to move. They remained locked in their tactical formation, an impenetrable barrier between me and the man who had spent my entire life teaching me that conditional love was the only kind I deserved. A holy union, I repeated, my voice carrying clearly over the heads of the guards. Is that what you are calling it? Dad? Did you miss the audio recording? Your perfect daughter was sleeping with my husband in my own home. There is nothing holy about anything happening here tonight. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. His eyes narrowed, flashing with a wrath that had absolutely nothing to do with righteous indignation and everything to do with his bruised ego. You are a disgrace, he bellowed, pointing a thick finger toward my face, entirely ignoring the guards who tensed at the sudden movement. You come into this venue, a place paid for by the sweat and reputation of this family, and you behave with such unhinged, malicious spite. You have chosen to air private, complicated matters in a room full of esteemed guests, purely out of vindictiveness. You are entirely devoid of grace. You are devoid of the Holy Spirit. And as of this exact moment, you are devoid of a family. The church elders sitting at the prime tables near the front leaned in their faces tight with scandalized awe. My father was performing for them, sacrificing his eldest daughter on the altar of public opinion to save his own righteous facade. I am officially excommunicating you from this family, he declared, his voice trembling with furious authority. You are no longer a daughter of this house. You have severed the ties of blood with your own hands tonight. Do not ever attempt to contact me or your mother again. You will find no welcome, no charity, and absolutely no quarter among us. He paused, letting the heavy pronouncement sink into the silent room, ensuring every high society guest registered that the Thomas family was excising the diseased branch. But he was not finished. He needed to twist the knife. He needed to inflict the ultimate punishment, the only thing he truly valued above all else. And understand this clearly, he continued, lowering his voice to a menacing, vicious register. First thing Monday morning, my attorneys will be instructed to strike your name completely from the family trust. You will receive nothing. But more importantly, you are permanently banished from the family estate. You will never, so help me God, set a single foot across the threshold of Big Mama's house ever again. A collective murmur rippled through the older guests who knew exactly what that meant. Big Mama's house was not just real estate, it was the crown jewel of the Thomas lineage. A sprawling, fully restored Queen Anne Victorian estate in the heart of Virginia Highland. My great-grandmother had purchased it with cash during the height of segregation, a massive symbol of Black wealth and resilience that had been passed down through generations. It was filled with priceless antiques, generations of family history, and sprawling gardens. My father treated it like a museum dedicated to his own greatness. Threatening to banish me from that historic property was his ultimate trump card, his way of completely erasing my existence from the family legacy. "You are dead to the Thomas name," he spat, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to beg for forgiveness to avoid losing the most valuable asset in our family history. I looked at the man who had chosen his image over his daughter. I looked at the absolute conviction in his eyes that he held all the power, that he held the keys to the kingdom, and could simply lock me out in the cold. I smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile that caused my father to falter, his crossed arms dropping slightly in confusion. I reached past the broad shoulder of my lead guard and unclasped the gleaming golden lock of my designer handbag. I did not break eye contact with my father as I reached inside. The crisp, thick parchment paper slid out easily. I stepped forward, parting the gap between my security detail just enough to reach the edge of the velvet-draped cocktail table nearest to him. With a flick of my wrist, I dropped the pristine, legally bound, heavily notarized deed right in front of him. The heavy cream parchment landed on the emerald tablecloth with a soft, definitive thud. I kept my posture completely rigid, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. My gaze followed a slow, deliberate path downward, forcing my father's eyes to track the movement from my face to the legal document resting between us. The heavy gold notary seal gleamed under the ballroom chandeliers, an undeniable mark of absolute binding truth. My father stared at the document. He did not reach for it. His thick hands remained balled into fists at his sides, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. The booming, authoritative presence he had commanded just moments ago was rapidly deflating, replaced by a creeping, suffocating apprehension. The church elders, men who had hung on his every word for decades, were now leaning forward in their seats, their faces tight with scandalized curiosity. "Go ahead and pick it up, Dad," I instructed, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "Read the bold print at the top. Read it aloud for your congregation." He swallowed hard, a visible bob of his Adam's apple, but he refused to move. He was a man who lived his entire life controlling the narrative, and he knew instantly that the paper on the table contained a story he could not manipulate. "Since you suddenly seem to have lost that booming pastoral voice, I will read it for you," I said, taking a slow step forward. My private security details shifted fluidly with me maintaining their protective barrier. "You just stood in front of 400 people and threatened to banish me from Big Mama's house. You threatened to write me out of a legacy you claim to protect, but you cannot banish anyone from a property you do not even own." The collective gasp from the audience was sharp and immediate. Vivian, who had been clutching Chloe's arm, suddenly dropped it. She whipped her head toward my father, her eyes wide with a brand new, entirely different kind of terror. "That is a lie," my father roared, though the sound lacked its previous thunder. It was a desperate, cornered defense. "That house has been in the Thomas family for 4 generations. It is the cornerstone of our heritage. It is entirely paid for. You are speaking blasphemy in a desperate attempt to humiliate me." It was the cornerstone of our heritage, I corrected him, my tone surgical and cold. It was entirely paid for. Until you decided that your pristine, untouchable public image was worth more than our great-grandmother's legacy, I gestured to the document on the table. 3 years ago, you quietly walked into a commercial bank, 2 counties over, far away from anyone in your congregation who might recognize you. You leveraged every single brick, every antique fixture, and every ounce of equity in Big Mama's house to secure a massive, discreet cash loan. Vivian practically lunged forward, her pearl necklace swinging wildly against her chest. "Thomas, what is she talking about?" Vivian demanded, her voice cracking with genuine panic. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not mortgage the estate." He could not look at her. The great Reverend Thomas, the man who preached about honesty and transparency every Sunday morning, could not even meet his own wife's eyes. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead, catching the bright venue lights. He needed cash quickly. I continued addressing Vivian, but keeping my voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. Untraceable, highly liquid cash. Because the church board was auditing the building fund, and they were getting dangerously close to discovering the massive financial discrepancies you had been hiding for years. The murmurs from the tables where the church elders sat turned into outraged, hostile whispers. Men in sharp suits were pulling out their phones, completely abandoning their loyalty to the man on the dance floor. "And that was not even the worst of it," I said, driving the nail deeper. "You needed that cash because the young, ambitious choir director who suddenly and mysteriously moved out of state needed a very generous, legally binding severance package to keep her mouth permanently shut about what was happening in your private office after Sunday services." My father stumbled backward, as if I had physically struck him. He grasped the back of a dining chair to steady himself, his face draining of all color. The facade of the righteous patriarch was entirely obliterated, leaving behind a terrified, corrupt man exposed in front of the very people he had spent his life manipulating. "The hush money kept you out of federal prison," I stated, stepping around the table to stand directly in front of him. "It kept you in the pulpit, but it bled you completely dry. You drained your personal accounts, and then you started missing the mortgage payments on the estate. 6 months of defaults, Dad. 6 months of ignored notices. The commercial bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings exactly 30 days ago. Big Mama's house, the jewel of the Thomas family, the property you just threatened to banish me from, was scheduled to be auctioned off on the county courthouse steps next Tuesday." Vivian let out a piercing wail, covering her face with her hands as she collapsed into a nearby chair. Chloe stood frozen, her own scandals temporarily eclipsed by the absolute financial and social ruin of our parents. The wedding had transitioned from a celebration into a spectacular, devastating public execution. "But it did not go to auction, did it?" my father whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes finally dropping to the notarized deed resting on the table. "The bank called me yesterday. They said a corporate buyer stepped in." I smiled, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure wash over me. The years of being treated like a secondary citizen, the years of being mocked and pushed aside, all dissolved into the cold marble floor beneath my feet. "That is right," I said, projecting my voice so clearly that it rang off the vaulted ceiling. "An anonymous holding company swooped in at the 11th hour. They purchased your distressed debt in its entirety. They satisfied the bank, paid off the outstanding balance, and assumed full legal ownership of the property, keeping your dirty, corrupt little secret completely out of the local newspapers." My father looked up at me, his eyes searching my face, a terrifying realization finally sinking into his mind. "Who?" He choked out, his hands shaking violently against the back of the chair. "Who bought the debt?" I smiled sweetly and looked him dead in the eyes. "I am the CEO of that holding company, Dad. I own Big Mama's house. I own the church's land. I own you." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a complete, catastrophic paradigm shift. My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a deflated, broken old man instead of the booming megachurch pastor he pretended to be. He stared at the deed resting on the velvet tablecloth, as if it were a venomous snake, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the table just to remain upright. Vivian was sobbing openly now, her face buried in her hands, her perfectly curated socialite facade completely shattered, mascara running down her fingers. The high society guests and church elders were muttering amongst themselves, physically pulling away from the head table, like the Thomas family was suddenly infectious. But as the visual perspective shifted, looking over my shoulder, my focus locked entirely onto Preston. I watched him process the absolute devastation of his grand master plan. His chest heaved beneath his custom-tailored tuxedo. The realization that he had just married into a bankrupt, fraudulent family, that the generational wealth and elite social standing he thought he was securing were nothing more than a desperate mirage, finally snapped whatever fragile restraint he had left. He realized he wasn't marrying into an empire. He was shackled to a sinking ship, anchored by a disgraced pastor and a cheating bride. Preston's head snapped toward me. The polished, aristocratic Southern gentleman vanished in an instant, completely replaced by a cornered, vicious predator. His face was mottled with a furious, ugly crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. He stepped away from Chloe, treating her like absolute garbage, practically shoving her aside as he locked his venomous, unhinged glare onto me. "You think this is some kind of game?" He sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt, projecting across the ruined ballroom. "You think you can just march in here with a fake piece of paper and play Monopoly with real money? I know exactly who you are, Nia. Chloe told me all about your pathetic little design business. You are a nobody." He took a heavy step forward, fists clenched, but my security detail instantly closed ranks. A synchronized wall of tactical gear and silent intimidation. Preston halted, forced to hurl his insults from a distance, which only made him look weaker and increasingly desperate. "You are a complete fraud," Preston spat, his upper lip curling in deep disgust. "Women like you do not just wake up and buy millions of dollars in historic real estate. Let us drop the act right now. What did you do? Win a lucky lottery ticket and suddenly think you belong in the boardroom? Or did you finally secure a rich sugar daddy who bought you a fake holding company to play with so you could feel important?" A collective gasp rippled through the remaining guests, but Preston was too unhinged to care about his audience anymore. The microaggressions he had expertly masked under his wealthy Southern charm were spilling out, toxic, unfiltered, and deeply racist. "You do not belong in our world," he continued, his voice echoing with belittling arrogance. "You are nothing but a common street thug playing dress-up in designer clothes. You think buying a piece of paper gives you leverage over me, over this family. You have absolutely no idea how real wealth operates. You arrogant, uneducated nobody. You are way out of your league." I stood perfectly still, my posture relaxed, letting him dig his own grave with every single word. The more he shouted, the more he exposed his own deep-seated insecurities and his desperate need to maintain control. I did not flinch at his insults. I did not offer a defensive rebuttal. I simply let his hatred hang in the air, allowing the entire room to witness the true nature of the man Chloe had chosen over her own sister. "I am going to destroy you!" Preston threatened, his voice dropping into a menacing guttural register as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You want to play with the big boys? Fine. Come Monday morning, I am unleashing my firm's legal team on you. Real lawyers. Corporate sharks who specialize in crushing pathetic little scammers like you. We will tie you up in endless litigation. We will sue you for defamation, for fraud, for emotional distress, and we will drag it out until you are entirely bankrupt. By the time my team is finished with you, you will be back to scrubbing floors where you belong. I will sue you into absolute oblivion." He paused, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged rhythms. He clearly expected me to cower. He expected me to show a sliver of the terror that was currently consuming his own soul. He actually thought his hollow threats of corporate litigation would intimidate a woman who had just orchestrated the hostile takeover of her own family's legacy without breaking a sweat. He fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic in the room. He was playing checkers, and I had just flipped the entire chessboard. I did not raise my voice to match his. I did not mirror his frantic, chaotic energy. I simply offered him a cold, pitying smile. Are you quite finished, Preston? I asked, my voice smooth, amplified, and utterly undisturbed, slicing through his hysteria like a surgical blade. Because while you are standing there threatening me with lawyers, you cannot actually afford, making blatantly racist assumptions about my intelligence and my bank account, you seem to have forgotten one very crucial detail. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The security guards parted seamlessly, a fluid motion of black suits and tactical precision allowing me a clear line of sight to the sweating, furious groom. You talk a tremendous amount about real wealth, Preston. You talk about corporate sharks and your prestigious elite investment firm. But we both know that is just another spectacular illusion, do we not? Just like my father's holy reputation, just like Chloe's innocent bride act, it is all smoke and mirrors masking a mountain of debt. Preston's eyes flickered. A tiny fraction of his rage was suddenly overshadowed by a creeping, icy panic. He swallowed hard, his jaw tight, but his ego refused to let him back down in front of his peers. "You are delusional," he snapped, though his voice notably lacked the booming confidence from a moment ago. "My firm manages billions. We are untouchable in this city. You have no idea who you are messing with." I didn't bother arguing with his lies. I didn't need to. I simply raised my left hand and gave a subtle practiced nod to the lead security guard standing at my shoulder. The massive man stepped forward, moving with terrifying silent efficiency. From the inside of his tactical jacket, he withdrew a thick, heavy, leather-bound legal binder. Preston watched the binder emerge, his eyes tracking the object with sudden, undeniable dread. The guard closed the distance between us, his heavy boots crunching over the shattered champagne glass on the floor, and stopped directly in front of Preston. With a hard, unceremonious shove, he drove the heavy binder directly into Preston's chest, forcing the groom to grab it with both hands, just to keep it from hitting the floor. Preston stared down at the object now resting in his hands. His breath caught in his throat with a loud, audible hitch. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. Imprinted squarely in the center of the dark leather cover, embossed in gleaming, undeniable gold foil, was the crest and logo of his very own supposedly untouchable investment firm. The heavy leather binder hit Preston's chest with a dull thud, forcing his arms to snap up and catch it before it plummeted to the marble floor. My gaze dropped, pulling the attention of the entire room down to the object he was now desperately clutching. His fingers were trembling so violently that the thick pages inside rattled against the binding. His knuckles were bone white, gripping the leather as if holding it tight enough could somehow change the reality of what was stamped on the cover. The gold foil logo of his own firm, Sterling and Vance Capital, gleamed under the chandeliers, a glaring spotlight on his impending ruin. "Open it, Preston!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom. He swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively, but his hands refused to cooperate. He stood frozen, a deer caught in the headlights of his own arrogance. I took a slow, measured step forward, closing the distance just enough to let him feel the absolute certainty radiating from my posture. "Since your hands seem to be failing you, I will gladly summarize the contents for your esteemed guests. That binder contains 300 pages of internal ledgers, hidden offshore routing numbers, and falsified quarterly returns. It is a comprehensive line-by-line map of every single phantom account you created to siphon millions of dollars from your clients over the past 4 years." Preston finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, panicked wheeze. "Where did you get this? This is impossible. Our servers are military grade. You are a failed interior designer. You are a college dropout." I let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed across the quiet room. "That is the narrative Chloe sold you, isn't it?" I asked, keeping my tone light, conversational, and entirely lethal. She needed to feel superior, so she told everyone I dropped out of college because I could not handle the pressure. She told you my boutique design firm was just a pathetic cover for a woman who was failing at life. It was a convenient lie, and you were arrogant enough to swallow it without doing a single background check on the woman you were actively trying to humiliate. I tilted my head, watching the sweat bead on his forehead and trace a line down his perfectly shaved jaw. "I did not drop out of university, Preston. I tested out. The curriculum was moving far too slowly, and I had better things to do with my time than sit in a lecture hall. While you were memorizing country club etiquette, learning how to properly hold a Scotch glass, and practicing your golf swing to impress old money investors, I was teaching myself complex data architecture. I spent my nights mastering forensic accounting algorithms, building backdoors into financial networks, and reverse engineering the exact kind of shell companies men like you use to hide their stolen cash. The wealthy investors seated around the dance floor began to shift uncomfortably. A low, anxious murmur rippled through the crowd as the men in tailored suits realized the implications of my words. I did not fail at design. I clarified, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. I just shifted my medium. I do not design living rooms. I design tracking software for dark money. I am the sole founder and owner of the top data forensics and fintech auditing firm in the Southeast. We are the ghost in the machine for every white-collar criminal who thinks they are too smart to be caught. Preston was shaking his head frantically, his perfectly styled hair falling out of place, his eyes wide and wild. He flipped the binder open, his eyes scanning the heavily highlighted pages, the red ink circling massive transfers to the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles. "You hacked my firm," he accused, his voice pitching high with desperation. "This is corporate espionage. This is stolen property. I will have you arrested right now. I will ruin you." "It is not stolen property, Preston. It is federally mandated evidence," I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the exact moment his fragile world completely collapsed. 6 months ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission noticed a series of highly irregular trading patterns coming from your supposedly untouchable multi-billion-dollar firm. They knew your internal security protocols were tight, designed specifically to delete data the moment a standard audit was triggered. They needed an external, highly specialized, independent forensic team to bypass your firewalls, extract the data silently, and build a criminal profile without tipping you off. I took another step closer, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "They hired my firm, Preston. The federal government handed me the keys to your entire digital life. I have spent the last 6 months reading your emails, tracking your wire transfers, and watching you steal from the very people sitting in this ballroom tonight." I turned my head slightly, scanning the crowd until I found the face of an older, distinguished man sitting at a prime table near the front. "Mr. Abernathy," I called out, my voice clear and unapologetic. "You might want to ask your new son-in-law why your commercial real estate trust was heavily leveraged last month to purchase a 5-carat diamond engagement ring and a fleet of luxury leased vehicles." The older man stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor, his face a mask of absolute outrage. Preston shrank back, clutching the binder to his chest as if it could protect him from the wrath of his own investors. "You stood there 5 minutes ago and called me socially unfit," I said, returning my full attention to Preston. "You used racist, belittling language. You called me a common street thug. You accused me of relying on a lottery ticket or a sugar daddy to acquire my wealth because your narrow, elitist worldview cannot comprehend a black woman outsmarting you. But the truth is standing right in front of you. You are the thug, Preston. You are the scammer. You built your entire life on stolen money and fraudulent prestige. You are nothing but a common thief in a Tom Ford suit." Preston let the binder drop. It hit the floor with a heavy smack, sliding slightly on the spilled champagne. He backed away, raising his hands in a frantic, dismissive gesture. "You cannot prove any of this in a court of law," he stammered, spittle flying from his lips as he tried desperately to regain control. "It is all entirely circumstantial. My legal team will rip your algorithms to shreds. I have the best corporate defense attorneys in the state on retainer. I will have them sue you for defamation. I will bury you in litigation until you cannot afford to breathe." I looked down at the Rolex on my wrist, watching the second hand sweep precisely past the 12. The timing was absolutely flawless. I looked back up at Preston, offering him a sweet, perfectly polite smile. "Your lawyers are going to be a little too busy to return your calls tonight, Preston, because the federal authorities and the local police are currently kicking down the glass doors of your corporate office downtown." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. A sweeping gaze across the room revealed a sea of horrified faces, gaping mouths, and frantic whispers. Elite investors were already pulling out their phones, rapidly dialing their brokers, desperate to pull whatever funds they could from Preston's crumbling empire. Preston himself seemed to lose all motor function. He dropped to his knees, right there on the illuminated dance floor, the heavy leather binder resting at his feet like a tombstone. Vivian, realizing that her new son-in-law was not the billionaire savior she thought he was, immediately decided to pivot her strategy. She could not save Preston, but she was entirely determined to save her own social standing. She wiped the running mascara from under her eyes, smoothed down the front of her custom silk gown, and marched toward me with forced, aggressive authority. She plastered on a condescending, deeply concerned expression that she had perfected over decades of passive-aggressive church luncheons. "That is enough," Nia Vivian announced, her voice pitched perfectly to project a mother's fake distress. "You have made your point. You are clearly having a severe mental breakdown. The stress of your sister's beautiful day has simply pushed you over the edge." She turned away from me, extending her manicured hands toward the tables closest to the dance floor. These tables were exclusively reserved for her country club inner circle, and Chloe's massive bridal party populated entirely by her elite sorority sisters. "Girls, please," Vivian pleaded, making direct eye contact with the sorority president, a wealthy heiress named Harper, who wielded immense social power in the city. "Help me escort my daughter out. She is not well. She needs psychiatric help, not an audience." Harper shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused glances with the other bridesmaids. A few of the older society matrons actually began to stand up, their expressions melting into sympathetic pity for poor, long-suffering Vivian. They bought the act entirely. They were ready to physically remove me from the premises just to protect the aesthetic of the wedding reception. "I am perfectly sane, Mother," I stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling and stopping the advancing women dead in their tracks. "But I completely understand why you want me out of this room. You are terrified of what else I might have found when my firm cracked open Preston's digital vaults." Vivian halted. The fake maternal concern completely vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated terror. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are speaking complete nonsense," she snapped, taking a quick step backward. I ignored her and turned my attention directly to Harper and the sprawling table of bridesmaids in their matching blush-pink gowns. "Harper, you are the current treasurer of the sorority's National Alumni Board. Correct? You oversee the Charity Scholarship Fund, the specific fund designed to provide full-ride university tuition for underprivileged girls from the inner city." Harper frowned, her posture stiffening defensively. "Yes, I am. We entrusted that fund to Sterling and Vance Capital last year, based on Chloe's glowing recommendation of Preston's firm." "Exactly," I said, offering a tight, unyielding smile. "It was a brilliant recommendation. For Chloe." During our forensic audit of Preston's accounts, my team was forced to trace every single dollar that moved through his servers. We had to verify the integrity of all the charitable trusts. "Do you want to know what we found when we audited the scholarship fund?" Chloe let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She practically scrambled away from Preston, lifting the heavy skirts of her gown to rush to her mother's side. She clutched Vivian's arm, her knuckles white. "Nia, shut up." Chloe shrieked, all traces of the blushing bride completely evaporated. "Do not say another word." "Your scholarship fund is empty, Harper," I announced, ignoring Chloe's frantic screaming. "It has been entirely drained, but the money did not just vanish into the ether. It was systematically routed through a series of offshore shell companies and deposited directly into a joint checking account shared by my mother and my sister." The silence in the ballroom became deafening. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Harper's face turned a shade of furious mottled red. The other bridesmaids covered their mouths in collective shock. "That is defamation!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, desperate pitch. "That is an absolute lie. We are a family of God. We are respected philanthropists. We would never steal from a charity." "You stole $350,000, I countered, my voice relentlessly, factual, hammering the final nails into their social coffins. The transaction logs are incredibly detailed. Would you like me to read the exact expenditures out loud for your friends? Because I can tell you precisely where that underprivileged scholarship money went. It went toward Vivian's $150,000 platinum initiation fee for the Oak Ridge Country Club. It paid for Chloe's 6-week luxury bachelorette trip to the Maldives. It paid for the very designer wedding gown Chloe is currently wearing. I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and my mother. You funded your elite country club lifestyle with money meant for girls who could not afford to buy textbooks. You literally stole the futures of desperate young women just so you could sip mimosas on a private golf course and pretend you were wealthy. Harper slowly stood up. She did not say a single word. She simply reached up, unpinned the delicate floral corsage identifying her as the maid of honor, and let it drop onto the table. She looked at Chloe with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound betrayal. Then she turned her back on the bride. It was like watching a domino effect of social execution. One by one, the other bridesmaids stood up. They did not shout. They did not cause a dramatic scene. They simply stood, turned their backs, and physically moved away. The older society women, the ones Vivian had spent years carefully cultivating and manipulating, immediately followed suit. Chairs scraped loudly against the marble floor as the most prominent, powerful women in the city stood up, turned their backs, and actively stepped away from the Thomas family. Vivian reached out her hands, shaking frantically as she tried to grab the arm of a passing socialite. "Margaret, please, you know me. You know this is a lie," she begged. Margaret yanked her arm away, as if Vivian were covered in toxic acid, shooting her a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion before walking briskly toward the exit. In a matter of seconds, a massive empty circle formed around Vivian and Chloe. They were completely isolated in the center of the grand ballroom, abandoned by the very elite society they had sacrificed everything to impress. The camera of the room's attention slowly pivoted from the disgraced mother and daughter to the man standing just a few feet away. The sweeping tracking shot of the shocked wedding guests settled into a tight, unforgiving focus on the fracturing relationship between the newlyweds. Preston Vance stood perfectly still, his polished loafers just inches away from the heavy leather binder he had dropped moments earlier. The glossy veneer of the sophisticated, aristocratic groom was peeling away in real time, revealing the cold, calculating opportunist underneath. He stared at Chloe, taking in her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, and the massive, fraudulent diamond glittering on her finger. The mathematical equation of his life was recalculating before his eyes. He had structured this marriage as a corporate merger. He was supposed to acquire the pristine Thomas family reputation, leverage their massive wealthy congregation to funnel clean money into his investment firm, and secure a compliant, photogenic wife to host his high society dinners. Instead, he had chained himself to a bankrupt, foreclosed family of embezzlers right at the exact moment his own multi-million-dollar fraud was being exposed to the federal government. He was not acquiring an empire. He was shackled to a sinking anvil. "Preston," Chloe whispered, her voice a fragile, desperate plea. She took a hesitant step toward him, her heavy silk train dragging across the marble floor. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she tried to grasp the lapel of his white tuxedo jacket. "Preston, please. We can fix this. We can explain everything. I love you." "Do not touch me," Preston snarled, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. He recoiled violently, slapping her hand away with a level of physical disgust that made several guests gasp aloud. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. "Preston, we just took our vows before God." Chloe cried out, fresh tears ruining her meticulously applied bridal makeup. "We are husband and wife. You promised to stand by me." "I am calling a judge the second I leave this building," Preston announced, his voice booming with cold administrative finality. "I am filing for an immediate annulment. This marriage is entirely void. It was built on fraudulent pretenses, and I am severing all legal ties to you and your pathetic broke family tonight." Chloe staggered backward as if he had physically struck her. She clutched her chest, struggling to breathe. Vivian lunged forward to catch her daughter, her own face pale with shock. "Preston, you cannot do this." Vivian pleaded, abandoning her pride in a desperate bid to save the marriage. You love her. You are a family now. I do not love her. Vivian. Preston laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I never loved her. I tolerated her. I needed a trophy wife who looked good in country club photographs and kept her mouth shut. I needed the Thomas family bank accounts and your husband's gullible congregation. Do you genuinely think I would have looked twice at this vapid, uneducated little girl if I knew she was completely broke? He turned his full attention back to Chloe, leaning in to ensure his words inflicted maximum damage. You are completely useless to me now, Chloe. You were supposed to be an asset, an accessory to elevate my status. Instead, you are a staggering liability. You are not a wealthy heiress. You are a common thief who steals from charity funds to buy dresses you cannot afford. You are nothing but a defective product, and I am returning you to the manufacturer. Chloe let out a devastated broken wail and collapsed onto the marble floor, her voluminous white dress spreading out around her like a surrendered flag. Vivian dropped to her knees beside her, but Preston did not even blink. His misogyny and deep-seated elitism were on full display, completely unfiltered and entirely brutal. He stepped directly over the train of Chloe's gown without a single glance downward, turning his back on his bride forever. He adjusted his cuffs, rolled his shoulders back, and walked deliberately toward me. The frantic cornered rat had vanished, replaced by a desperate negotiator trying to salvage his own survival. He stopped a few feet away from my security detail, his eyes locking onto mine. He completely ignored the devastation he had just caused behind him. All right, Nia, Preston said, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial murmur. He offered me a tight, calculated smile. You have made your point. You completely destroyed them. You exposed your father, you ruined your mother, and you utterly humiliated your sister on her wedding day. It was a spectacular execution. You won. I remained perfectly still, watching him try to pivot. You and I, we are clearly the only intelligent people in this room, Preston continued, attempting to project a sense of corporate camaraderie. We understand how the real world operates. We understand leverage. You are a brilliant woman, much smarter than this entire useless family combined. So let us talk business. Let us make a mutually beneficial arrangement. I tilted my head, allowing him the silence he needed to hang himself. I will walk away from Chloe tonight, he promised, gesturing casually over his shoulder. I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements you want. I will leave the Thomas family to burn in the ashes you created, and I will not lift a single finger to help them. In exchange, you call off your forensic dogs. You have the access codes to the SEC audit files. You know how to manipulate the data. You go into those servers, you corrupt the primary evidence files, and you blame it on a system migration error. Make the audit disappear. He leaned closer, his eyes gleaming with greedy desperation. If you wipe the slate clean for me, I will cut you in. I have offshore accounts in the Caymans that the federal government does not even know exist yet. I will wire $10 million into your holding company by midnight. We walk away rich, and these parasites get exactly what they deserve. We have a deal. I looked at the man standing before me. I looked at the tailored tuxedo, the expensive watch, and the absolute moral bankruptcy rotting his core. He had just discarded his bride like trash, and was now attempting to bribe a federal auditor on an open dance floor. I let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds before I finally reacted. I laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a cold, genuine, echoing laugh that pierced the tension in the room. I shook my head slowly, looking at him with nothing but pure, unadulterated pity. You truly are delusional, Preston, I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. You think this is a negotiation. You think you are sitting at a boardroom table offering me a percentage of your stolen empire. But you have absolutely nothing left to offer me. I stepped forward, forcing him to take a step back. I do not make deals with criminals, Preston. I expose them. I do not need your dirty hidden money because my firm makes more in a single fiscal quarter than you managed to steal in 4 years. You are not a partner. You are a target. You are the final item on my checklist. I smiled sweetly, watching the last sliver of hope completely drain from his eyes. And even if I wanted to help you, I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, icy whisper. It is far too late for a cover-up. You should probably check your phone, Preston. The local police have finished raiding your corporate office downtown, and the FBI is already pulling up to the venue. The words had barely left my mouth before the heavy velvet drapes covering the floor-to-ceiling ballroom windows were suddenly illuminated. A frantic strobing wash of red and blue lights bled through the fabric, casting harsh, violent shadows across the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the remaining guests. The distant rising wail of multiple sirens cut through the dead silence of the room, growing louder by the second until it felt like the noise was vibrating right up through the marble floorboards. Preston froze. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell. He spun around, staring at the flashing lights painting the walls, his mind finally catching up to the absolute reality of his destruction. The elite corporate shark persona completely evaporated. There was no more bravado, no more threats of high-priced lawyers, and no more racist, elitist insults. There was only the primal, desperate instinct of a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at my mother. He did not even look at me. He just ran. Preston bolted toward the service doors at the back of the ballroom, shoving his way past a terrified waiter and knocking a tray of champagne glasses to the floor with a spectacular crash. He was frantic, his polished dress shoes slipping wildly on the spilled liquid as he scrambled for the exit. He was actually trying to abandon his own wedding reception, leaving his bride and his humiliated in-laws behind to face the federal authorities while he scurried into the night. But my security detail was already moving. The lead guard, the one who had driven the damning binder into Preston's chest, did not even break a sweat. He took 3 long, calculated strides, intercepting Preston just inches away from the swinging service doors. Preston slammed into the guard's solid tactical frame like a bird hitting a pane of glass. He bounced off with a pathetic, breathless grunt, stumbling backward and landing hard on his hands and knees. "Get out of my way," Preston screamed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. He scrambled back to his feet wildly, throwing a desperate, uncoordinated punch at the guard. The guard easily sidestepped the blow, grabbed Preston by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, and slammed him hard against the oak-paneled wall. The impact knocked the wind completely out of Preston. He slumped against the wood, gasping for air, pinned effortlessly by a man who looked entirely bored by the encounter. "Let him go!" Chloe shrieked, finally snapping out of her paralyzed state of shock. She lunged forward, charging across the dance floor in a blind panic. She completely forgot the heavy trailing layers of her designer wedding gown. As she ran toward Preston, the delicate imported French lace of her train caught violently under the heavy heel of a fleeing groomsman. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the room. Chloe let out a devastated scream as the bottom half of her $100,000 dress was violently ripped away, the intricate beading and layers of tulle completely shredded. She stumbled, tangling her feet in the ruined fabric, and crashed to the floor, right in the center of the ballroom. She did not try to get up. She just sat there in the middle of her destroyed fairy tale, clutching the torn pieces of silk, sobbing uncontrollably as her perfect day devolved into an absolute nightmare. At that exact moment, the grand double doors of the ballroom burst open with deafening force. A flood of law enforcement poured into the room. Local police officers in dark uniforms secured the perimeter, ordering the remaining guests to stay exactly where they were, while men and women in tactical windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters FBI fanned out across the marble floor. The sheer, overwhelming presence of federal agents inside the most exclusive country club in the city shattered the last remaining illusion of high society untouchability. Wealthy socialites and church elders scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the walls, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive disaster unfolding in the center of the room. A stern-faced federal agent with a clipboard walked directly onto the dance floor, flanked by 2 armed officers. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the sobbing bride and the cowering guests, until he locked onto the man pinned against the wall. Preston Vance, the agent, announced, his voice booming with absolute, undeniable authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering." Preston went completely limp against the wall. He did not fight as the police officers pulled his arms behind his back, and the cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs clicked definitively shut around his wrists. The elite investment banker, the man who had just stood in front of me spewing arrogance and superiority, was now reduced to a trembling, weeping mess, being dragged across the floor of his own wedding reception in front of the most powerful people in the city. Vivian was screaming now, a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated social terror. She rushed toward the federal agent, her hands waving frantically in the air. "There has been a mistake," she cried out, her voice raw and desperate. "He is a respected businessman. We are the Thomas family. You cannot do this here. You are ruining my daughter's wedding." The agent did not even blink. He held up a hand, stopping Vivian dead in her tracks. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered coldly. "We are executing a federal warrant. I stood quietly near the head table, watching the flawless execution of absolute justice. My pulse was steady. My mind was completely clear. I had spent years watching these people manipulate, steal, and destroy lives from behind their pulpit of fake righteousness. I had spent years building the exact skills necessary to tear their corrupt empire down brick by brick. And now the final blow was being delivered. But the operation was not quite finished. The federal agent turned away from Preston and Vivian. He looked down at the clipboard in his hand, flipping to the second page of the thick stack of legal documents. His eyes scanned the crowd once more, this time moving past the disgraced groom and the hysterical mother of the bride. "Reverend Marcus Thomas," the agent called out, his voice cutting through Chloe's sobbing and the chaotic murmur of the crowd. My father, who had been leaning heavily against the head table, suddenly froze. He looked up, his face entirely drained of blood, his eyes wide with a brand new paralyzing kind of terror. "We also have a federal warrant for your arrest," the agent stated, taking a decisive step toward the head table. "You are being charged with severe financial misconduct, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud in connection with Sterling and Vance Capital." My father did not speak. He did not try to deny it. He did not try to offer a booming pastoral defense. He simply let out a sharp, ragged gasp and clutched his chest with both hands. His knees buckled beneath him, and the great untouchable patriarch of the Thomas family collapsed heavily to the floor, falling completely to his knees. But it was not a heart attack. It was the crushing, suffocating realization that the walls had finally closed in and he was going down with them. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the marble reverberated through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Reverend Marcus Thomas, a man who had spent 3 decades commanding arenas of tens of thousands of devoted followers, was now hyperventilating on the floor of a country club. His perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket bunched around his shoulders as he stared blankly at the polished shoes of the federal agents surrounding him. I stepped around the shattered crystal and torn tool littering the dance floor, closing the distance until I was standing directly over him. I looked down at the top of his graying head. There was no pity in my chest. There was only the cold, sharp clarity of absolute justice. "Did you honestly think I would audit Sterling and Vance Capital and not check the destination of the outbound wire transfers?" I asked, my voice ringing out with lethal precision. "Did you think a forensic algorithm designed to hunt international cartels would simply overlook the massive glaring anomalies in your tax-exempt religious accounts?" Marcus slowly tilted his head up. His face was a ghastly shade of gray. Sweat poured down his temples, ruining his carefully curated television-ready appearance. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some booming, charismatic excuse, but only a pathetic, raspy wheeze escaped his lips. "You sold me out, Dad," I continued, making sure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. "You stood at the pulpit every Sunday and preached about integrity, family, and the grace of God. You told your congregation that I was a lost soul, a rebellious daughter who had strayed from the righteous path. You used my absence to garner sympathy, painting yourself as a long-suffering father. But the reality is, you pushed me away because I asked too many questions. I was the only person in this family smart enough to realize that your multi-million-dollar lifestyle did not match a pastor's salary." The church elders seated near the front began to murmur, their expressions shifting from shock to horrified comprehension. "Preston did not just court Chloe because she was pretty," I stated, gesturing toward the handcuffed groom who was currently being hauled toward the exit. Preston courted Chloe because he desperately needed a laundry machine for his stolen corporate funds, and you, Reverend Thomas, handed him the keys to the largest tax-exempt washing machine in the state. I turned slightly, addressing the horrified congregation members and society elites who were still backed against the walls. My father and Preston Vance have been running a highly sophisticated offshore money laundering syndicate for the past 4 years, I announced. Preston siphoned millions from his elite investors and transferred the dirty cash into the church's global mission funds. My father then routed that exact same money through a dozen shell ministries in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, washing it clean under the absolute protection of religious tax exemption. They split the profits right down the middle. Lies, Marcus suddenly gasped, clutching his chest harder. He forced himself to look at his congregation, his voice trembling with manufactured righteous indignation. She is an agent of deception. She is trying to destroy the ministry. Do not listen to her. The FBI agent standing next to me did not hesitate. He pulled a thick bound warrant from his jacket and dropped it onto the floor right in front of my father's trembling hands. It is not a lie, Marcus, the agent stated coldly. We have the IP logs. We have the encrypted server backups. We have 72 hours of your recorded phone calls coordinating the transfer of stolen funds to an account in Geneva. You are going to federal prison for a very long time. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Marcus let out a strangled, animalistic cry. He did not look like a man of God anymore. He looked exactly like what he was, a terrified, greedy fraud facing the absolute destruction of his empire. The officers hauled him roughly to his feet, snapping the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. I watched him struggle, his eyes wide and panicked. You thought you were so untouchable, I said quietly, stepping right up to his face. You thought you could partner with a white-collar criminal, steal from your own devoted followers, and use my sister as a corporate bargaining chip. You called me a disappointment because I chose to build my own life instead of worshiping your fake prestige. But my honest work is what just brought down your entire criminal syndicate. As the officers began to march my father toward the grand double doors, a sudden piercing shriek shattered the remaining tension. Vivian, who had been kneeling beside her sobbing daughter, suddenly bolted upright. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, frantically calculating the total devastation. She looked at Preston being shoved into a police cruiser outside the window. She looked at her husband being dragged away in handcuffs. And then she looked at the federal agents who were now moving methodically through the room, officially seizing the wedding gifts, the catering equipment, and the luxury vehicles parked outside as evidence of crimes committed with stolen funds. No, Vivian screamed, her voice tearing completely at the seams. No, no, no. The house, the cars, the country club. She realized it all at once. Every single designer gown, every piece of custom jewelry, the sprawling mansion in the gated community, the lavish society luncheons. Every single cent of her elite, untouchable lifestyle was funded entirely by federal fraud. The government was not just taking her husband. They were taking everything. She was going to be left with absolutely nothing. The socialite queen of the city was about to become a destitute, homeless pariah. Her eyes locked onto me. The realization that I was the only person in the room who actually possessed clean legal wealth hit her like a freight train. I was a legitimate billionaire. I was her only lifeline. Vivian scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees. Her custom silk gown dragged through spilled champagne and ruined cake. She did not care about her dignity. She did not care about her friends watching. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around my legs and grabbing my ankles with a desperate, bruising grip. Nia, please, Vivian sobbed, burying her tear-stained, mascara-streaked face into my shoes. Please, you have to help me. I am your mother. I did not know what they were doing. I swear I did not know. You have to protect me. Please, I am begging you, have mercy. The glaring red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside strobed rhythmically across Vivian's tear-stained face as I looked down at her. Her perfectly highlighted hair was disheveled, clinging to the damp tracks of mascara running down her cheeks. The heavy diamond necklace at her throat caught the flashing lights, a glaring symbol of the stolen money that had funded her entire existence. She clung to my ankles with a grip fueled by absolute primal panic. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me was now literally groveling at my feet on the ruined floor of the country club she had idolized. "Nia, you have to listen to me," Vivian sobbed, her voice cracking as she stared up at me with wild, desperate eyes. "We are family. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I carried you in my womb. You cannot just stand there and watch them destroy us. You have the money now. You have the power. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country for your father. You can pay back whatever they say is missing. We can make this go away quietly." She clawed at the fabric of my tailored trousers, her acrylic nails scraping against my skin. "Blood is thicker than water, Nia," she pleaded, leaning heavily on the single phrase abusers always use when they have run out of actual currency. "You have to remember that. Family protects family. When the world turns against you, the only people you can truly count on are your own flesh and blood. You are my daughter. You owe us that much loyalty. Please do not turn your back on your own mother in her darkest hour." I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply stared down at the woman who had systematically dismantled my self-esteem for 29 years. I felt the cold, hard weight of reality settle over me, completely erasing any lingering trace of a desperate child wanting her mother's approval. I deliberately shifted my stance, forcing her grip to slip from my ankles. I stepped back, severing the physical connection between us. The marble floor was slick with spilled champagne, but my footing had never been more secure. "Blood did not keep you from throwing me out," I said, my voice echoing with a calm, lethal precision that made the remaining guests hold their collective breath. "Blood did not keep you from laughing at my pain 20 minutes ago when you thought Preston was untouchable. You stood right there, Vivian, and called me a failed, socially unfit dropout. You tried to have me physically dragged out of this room by your country club friends because my mere presence was an embarrassment to your aesthetic." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her heavy eyelashes, but I cut her off completely. "Do not dare weaponize motherhood now, just because your fraudulent empire is burning to the ground." I commanded, my words striking her like physical blows. "You did not act like a mother when you drained a charity scholarship fund meant for desperate girls to pay for your elite golf memberships. You did not act like a mother when you allowed my father to launder stolen money through the church just so you could wear designer gowns and pretend you were better than everyone else. You only remembered we shared DNA the exact second you realized I was a billionaire and you were completely broke." I looked around the devastated ballroom. The federal agents were methodically tagging the lavish floral centerpieces and the towering 6-tier wedding cake. Officers were securing the exits. The remaining high society guests were clustered against the far walls, whispering frantically, watching the spectacular demise of the Thomas family. "You want me to buy you out of federal racketeering charges?" I asked, bringing my gaze back to the pathetic figure on the floor. "You want me to take the money I earned through honest, relentless hard work and use it to bail out a syndicate of thieves? You want me to save you from the consequences of your own greed?" I leaned down slightly, ensuring my voice was low enough for only her to hear the absolute finality of my decision. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I whispered. "You built a life entirely on deception, and now the bill has finally come due. You are going to lose this house. You are going to lose your status. You will never step foot in this country club again unless you are hired to clean the floors. You are going to watch your husband go to federal prison, and you will likely join him. And I will not spend a single solitary cent to stop it." Vivian let out a guttural, devastated wail. She collapsed fully onto the marble, burying her face in her hands as the absolute reality of her ruined life crashed down upon her. She curled into a tight, trembling ball, completely broken by the truth she could no longer outrun. I straightened up, feeling a profound, incredible sense of liberation. The invisible chains of obligation and familial guilt that had bound me for decades simply shattered into dust. I turned away from my weeping mother, preparing to walk out of the ballroom and leave the Thomas family to face the legal wreckage of their own creation. But I had momentarily forgotten about Chloe. Across the dance floor, my sister was sitting in the ruins of her custom designer gown. She had watched her husband publicly humiliate and discard her. She had watched her powerful bridesmaids abandon her. She had watched our father get dragged away in handcuffs by federal agents. And now she had just watched our mother grovel at my feet only to be utterly and completely rejected. Chloe's entire reality had been violently ripped away in the span of 30 minutes. The golden child, the perfect daughter, the elite bride was left with nothing but a shredded dress and a disgraced name. She stared at me, her eyes wide, wild, and entirely unhinged. The heavy mascara smeared around her eyes made her look feral. She saw me turning to leave. She saw me walking away untouched, successful, and completely free, while she was trapped in a nightmare. Something inside her fragile, pampered mind simply snapped. With a raw, terrifying scream that tore through the air, Chloe scrambled to her feet. She kicked away the heavy, torn layers of her silk train, her bare feet slipping on the marble as she launched herself forward. Her hands curled into tight, vicious claws. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, murderous hatred as she charged blindly across the dance floor, aiming directly for my back. Her bare feet slapped against the cold marble, the sound sharp and frantic beneath the wailing sirens outside. She closed the distance with terrifying speed. Her arms raised, her manicured nails aimed directly at my face. She expected me to flinch. She expected me to cower just as I had when we were children, and she threw her vicious, unprovoked tantrums, fully aware that our parents would always take her side. But I did not move a single muscle. Before Chloe could even cross the last few feet of the dance floor, my lead security guard stepped seamlessly into her path. It was a fluid, effortless motion, completely devoid of malice, but packed with an immovable, absolute authority. He did not strike her or grab her. He simply planted his solid frame between us and raised a single heavily muscled arm using her own reckless, uncontrollable momentum against her. Chloe slammed into his forearm as if she had just sprinted headfirst into a brick wall. The impact knocked the breath out of her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. She rebounded violently, her bare feet sliding on a puddle of spilled champagne. Her arms flailed in a desperate attempt to find her balance, but there was nothing left for her to hold on to. She went down hard. Her knees hit the marble floor with a sickening crack, followed immediately by the rest of her body, as she collapsed into a tangled, trembling heap of shredded designer silk and shattered pride. For a moment, the ballroom was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic pulsing flash of the red and blue police lights painting the walls. The remaining country club elites, the society matrons, and the disgraced bridesmaids stood frozen in place, watching the absolute destruction of the Thomas family's golden child. Then the dam broke. "You ruined my life!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing from her throat in a ragged, feral shriek. She thrashes against the floor, pounding her fists against the marble until her knuckles bruised. "You ruined my wedding. You ruined my husband. You took everything away from me. I hate you. I have always hated you. You are nothing but a jealous, vindictive monster." She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her face a terrifying mask of running mascara and unhinged fury. "You did this because you could not stand to see me happy. You could not stand that they loved me more. You destroyed my entire life just to punish me." I looked down at her. I looked at the girl who had spent 29 years tormenting me, belittling my achievements, and parading her unearned stolen wealth in my face. I looked at the girl who had built her entire identity on being superior to the sister she deemed a pathetic failure. She was no longer a radiant high society bride. She was just a broken, empty shell screaming into a void. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. My bodyguard shifted slightly, ready to intervene again, but I held up my hand, signaling him to stand down. I did not need protection from Chloe anymore. She possessed absolutely no power over me. I crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. The heavy silk of my tailored suit pooled neatly around my heels, a stark contrast to the ruined, dirty fabric wrapped around her legs. I looked directly into her wild, bloodshot eyes, holding her frantic gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. "I did not ruin your life, Chloe," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying a sharp, lethal edge that sliced cleanly through her hysterical sobbing. "I just handed you the mirror you have been avoiding your whole life." She blinked, her breath hitching in her throat, temporarily stunned into silence by the cold, absolute certainty in my tone. "You have spent your entire existence believing you were better than everyone else. I continued, keeping my voice low and completely steady. You believed you were smarter, prettier, and more deserving of the world simply because mother and father told you that you were. They handed you a life built on a pedestal of stolen money and fraudulent prestige, and you never once possessed the basic intelligence or the moral compass to question where it all came from. You just took it. You took the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the expensive vacations, and you used them to mock anyone who actually had to work for a living, especially me. I leaned in a fraction of an inch closer, making sure she felt the full weight of her reality. You thought Preston was your ultimate prize. You thought marrying a billionaire was your final ascension into the elite stratosphere. But Preston did not look at you and see a partner, Chloe. He looked at you and saw a highly convenient, thoroughly gullible accessory to federal racketeering. He needed a pretty empty vessel attached to a corrupt church so he could wash his stolen money. That is all you ever were to him. A laundering mechanism in a white dress. No, she whimpered, shaking her head frantically from side to side. Her hands clutched the sides of her head as if trying to physically block out my words. He loves me. He is my husband. He just annulled your marriage on this very dance floor and offered to bribe me with $10 million to let him walk away from you, I reminded her, my words landing with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. You have absolutely nothing left, Chloe. Your husband is going to federal prison. Your father is currently being loaded into the back of an FBI transport vehicle for stealing from his own congregation. Your mother is going to lose everything she owns to government seizure, and she will likely face conspiracy charges of her own. And you are a broke, unemployed accessory who just went viral in front of the entire city for funding your luxury lifestyle with money meant for underprivileged girls. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked down at her one last time, feeling the final heavy chains of my childhood completely fall away. I did not take anything away from you, I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, tense space of the ballroom. I simply turned on the lights. You are the one who has to live with what was hiding in the dark. Chloe let out a long, hollow sob, curling back into a tight ball on the marble floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, crying for the fairy tale she had never actually owned, mourning an empire built entirely on sand. I turned my back on her, stepping away from the shattered remnants of my family. The ballroom was chaotic, filled with the harsh crackle of police radios and the frantic whispering of the remaining guests trying to figure out how to escape the venue without drawing the attention of the federal agents. I took a deep breath, adjusting my cuffs, ready to signal my team that it was finally time to leave this nightmare behind. Before I could take another step, a sharply dressed man with a clipboard hurried across the floor, dodging a team of officers securing the catering tables. He looked incredibly pale, sweating profusely under the collar of his uniform. It was the general manager of the country club. He stopped directly in front of me, his eyes darting nervously toward the sobbing bride on the floor and the flashing lights outside before finally settling on my calm, authoritative posture. "Excuse me, Miss Thomas," the venue manager stammered frantically, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "I apologize for the interruption, but the authorities are locking down the premises, and your father's credit cards have just been universally declined by our system. Given the circumstances, I urgently need to know what you want us to do with the remaining catering, the staff, and the rest of these guests." The general manager stood trembling in front of me, the metal clip of his board rattling against his damp knuckles. He was waiting for an instruction, terrified that the sudden federal raid would bankrupt his precious, exclusive establishment. He knew the Thomas family had booked the grand ballroom, the terrace, and the entire East Wing for the weekend. He knew the catering bill alone reached deep into the six figures. What he did not know was who actually held the deed to the marble beneath his polished shoes. I looked past him, taking in the full, sweeping view of the opulent room. The crystal chandeliers cast fractured, brilliant light over the panic below. Federal agents were methodically dismantling the physical evidence of my family's fraudulent empire, stacking ledgers and securing assets while the elite guests cowered in their designer evening wear. It was a picture of absolute terrifying control, and it belonged entirely to me. "Mr. Sterling," I said, reading the gold nameplate pinned to his lapel, "you do not need to worry about my father's declined credit cards. The outstanding balance for tonight's event, as well as the complete operational costs for this facility, have already been settled. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process my words. Settled, he stammered. Miss Thomas, I do not understand. The accounts are completely frozen. They are no longer your concern, I interrupted smoothly. Sterling and Vance Capital did not just launder money through my father's church. They also leveraged their illicit funds to acquire prime real estate across the state, including this very country club. When my firm initiated the hostile takeover of Preston's assets yesterday morning, we absorbed all collateral properties. I am not a guest at this venue, Mr. Sterling. As of 24 hours ago, I am the majority shareholder and sole owner of this entire estate. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of socialites who had been eavesdropping on our conversation. Vivian's head snapped up from the floor, her tear-streaked face contorting in fresh horror. Chloe stopped sobbing, entirely staring at me, as if I had suddenly grown 10 feet tall. They had spent their entire lives treating this country club as their personal kingdom, using its exclusive membership to look down on the rest of the world. Now they were trespassing in my house. This wedding is officially canceled, I announced, my voice carrying effortlessly across the vast room, silencing the remaining murmurs. However, perfectly good food should never go to waste. I want your entire kitchen staff to box up the remaining catering. The prime rib, the caviar, the hors d'oeuvres, and every single unopened bottle of imported champagne. Have it all loaded into the club's refrigerated transport vans immediately. Where should we send it, ma'am? The manager asked, hastily scribbling on his clipboard, completely subservient to his new boss. To the Safe Haven Women's Shelter downtown, I replied. The one my firm sponsors. The women and children there are rebuilding their lives from scratch. Let them enjoy the feast my father and his corrupt son-in-law tried to steal from the public. Ensure it arrives fresh and untouched. Right away, Miss Thomas. Consider it done. He nodded frantically and scurried off toward the service doors, shouting crisp orders to the bewildered waitstaff, who immediately began clearing the untouched tables. I turned my attention to the hundreds of wealthy guests still pressing themselves against the oak-paneled walls. These were the church elders, the investment bankers, and the society matrons who had spent the last 2 decades smiling at me with thinly veiled pity while kissing my mother's ring. As for the rest of you, I projected, meeting their terrified, wide-eyed stares. The federal authorities have secured the exits. Once they have taken your names and verified you are not carrying any stolen assets, you are free to leave. I suggest you do so quickly. This property is now closed to the public and all of your memberships are currently under review by my corporate board. Have a safe drive home. The exodus was immediate and chaotic. Wealthy men and women tripped over themselves, practically running toward the main lobby to escape the radioactive fallout of the Thomas family. They did not stop to offer condolences to Vivian. They did not pause to help Chloe up from the floor. They abandoned them with the exact same ruthless self-interest that my family had always championed. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was stripped of its audience, leaving only federal agents, scattered debris, and the broken remnants of my mother and sister. I walked slowly toward the center of the dance floor, stopping just a few feet away from where Vivian and Chloe remained, huddled together amidst the shredded silk and spilled wine. They looked up at me. 2 women who had built their entire identities on the illusion of superiority were now reduced to pathetic, shivering trespassers. You heard the instructions, I said, the absolute chill in my tone, leaving zero room for negotiation. This is private property, and you are no longer welcome here. Nia, please. Vivian choked out her voice, a fragile, raspy whisper. She clutched Chloe's arm, her hands trembling violently. Where are we supposed to go? The FBI seized the house. They seized the bank accounts. We do not have a car. We do not have anything. You cannot just throw us out into the street in the middle of the night. You are resourceful, Mother. I am sure you will figure it out. I replied, my expression unyielding. You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property before I have my security team physically remove you for trespassing. I suggest you start walking. You are a monster. Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she struggled to her feet, leaning heavily against Vivian. Her ruined wedding dress hung off her in heavy, damp rags. "You are cold, heartless, and evil. We are your family." "Blood is just biology, Chloe," I stated, not backing down an inch. "Loyalty is earned, and you bankrupted yours a long time ago." 4 minutes. I turned away, dismissing them entirely as my security detail stepped forward. They formed an imposing wall of dark suits to escort the weeping women toward the service exit. I did not watch them leave. I did not need to. The total eradication of their power was already complete. I walked toward the grand double doors of the main lobby, intending to speak with the lead federal agent to finalize the handover of the church's financial records. As I approached the threshold, 2 heavily armed tactical officers were marching my father toward the exit. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked sharply against his wrists. His tailored tuxedo was rumpled, his hair unkempt, and the arrogant, untouchable aura of Reverend Marcus Thomas was entirely gone. Just as they reached the glass doors, my father planted his feet, forcing the officers to temporarily halt. He twisted his body around, his eyes burning with a furious, unholy rage as he locked onto me, standing calmly in the center of the foyer. The mask of the benevolent pastor completely melted away, revealing the bitter, vindictive narcissist underneath. He bared his teeth, spitting his final, desperate venom across the marble floor. "You think you have won?" Marcus snarled, his voice guttural and dripping with absolute hatred. "You think destroying your own family makes you powerful. But you are empty, Nia. You have always been empty. You will die alone with your money, and no one will ever truly love you." I stepped around the shattered crystal and torn tool littering the dance floor, closing the distance until I was standing directly over him. From a low angle, the grand, sparkling chandeliers framed my silhouette as I towered over my kneeling father. The great Reverend Marcus Thomas, a man who had spent 3 decades commanding arenas of tens of thousands of devoted followers, was now hyperventilating on the floor of a country club. His perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket bunched around his shoulders as he stared blankly at the polished shoes of the federal agents surrounding him. There was no pity in my chest. There was only the cold, sharp clarity of absolute justice. I had waited years for this exact moment, meticulously gathering every shred of evidence required to expose the rot hiding beneath his holy veneer. "Did you honestly think I would audit Sterling and Vance Capital and not check the destination of the outbound wire transfers?" I asked, my voice ringing out with lethal precision, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. "Did you think a forensic algorithm designed to hunt international cartels would simply overlook the massive, glaring anomalies in your tax-exempt religious accounts?" Marcus slowly tilted his head up. His face was a ghastly shade of gray. Sweat poured down his temples, ruining his carefully curated television-ready appearance. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some booming, charismatic excuse, but only a pathetic, raspy wheeze escaped his lips. The man who could command a stadium with his baritone voice was entirely speechless. "You sold me out, Dad," I continued, making sure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. "You stood at the pulpit every Sunday and preached about integrity, family, and the grace of God. You told your congregation that I was a lost soul, a rebellious daughter who had strayed from the righteous path. You used my absence to garner sympathy, painting yourself as a long-suffering father burdened by an ungrateful child. But the reality is, you pushed me away because I asked too many questions. I was the only person in this family smart enough to realize that your multi-million-dollar lifestyle did not match a pastor's modest salary." The church elders seated near the front began to murmur, their expressions shifting from shock to horrified comprehension. Decades of blind trust were crumbling right in front of their eyes. "Preston did not just court Chloe because she was pretty," I stated, gesturing toward the handcuffed groom who was currently being hauled toward the exit by 2 unsmiling agents. "Preston courted Chloe because he desperately needed a laundry machine for his stolen corporate funds. And you," Reverend Thomas handed him the keys to the largest tax-exempt washing machine in the state. "You sacrificed your own daughter's future to secure a business partner." I turned slightly, addressing the horrified congregation members and society elites who were still backed against the walls, watching their pristine world burn to ash. My father and Preston Vance have been running a highly sophisticated offshore money laundering syndicate for the past 4 years, I announced. Preston siphoned millions from his elite investors, stealing their life savings, and transferred the dirty cash directly into the church's global mission funds. My father then routed that exact same money through a dozen shell ministries in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, washing it clean under the absolute protection of religious tax exemption. The respected Reverend and his shiny new white son-in-law were conspiring together to launder money, splitting the profits right down the middle while preaching about salvation. Lies Marcus suddenly gasped, clutching his chest harder. He forced himself to look at his congregation, his voice trembling with a manufactured desperate righteous indignation. She is an agent of deception. She is trying to destroy the ministry. Do not listen to her. This is a test of our faith. The FBI agent standing next to me did not hesitate. He pulled a thick-bound warrant from his windbreaker and dropped it onto the floor right in front of my father's trembling hands. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the marble echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. "It is not a lie," Marcus the agent stated coldly. "We have the IP logs. We have the encrypted server backups. We have 72 hours of your recorded phone calls coordinating the transfer of stolen funds to an account in Geneva. We have the bank statements proving you stole from the very people who trusted you most. You are going to federal prison for a very long time. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Marcus let out a strangled, animalistic cry. He did not look like a man of God anymore. He looked exactly like what he was, a terrified, greedy fraud facing the absolute destruction of his empire. The officers hauled him roughly to his feet, snapping the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. The metallic click sealed his fate forever. I watched him struggle, his eyes wide and panicked as reality fully set in. "You thought you were so untouchable," I said quietly, stepping right up to his face, so he had no choice but to look at me. "You thought you could partner with a white-collar criminal, steal from your own devoted followers, and use my sister as a corporate bargaining chip without any consequences. You called me a disappointment because I chose to build my own life instead of worshiping your fake prestige. But my honest work is exactly what just brought down your entire criminal syndicate." As the officers began to march my father toward the grand double doors, a sudden piercing shriek shattered the remaining tension. Vivian, who had been kneeling beside her sobbing daughter in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly bolted upright. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, frantically calculating the total devastation. She looked at Preston being shoved into a police cruiser outside the window. She looked at her husband being dragged away in handcuffs, his head hung low in ultimate defeat. And then she looked at the federal agents who were now moving methodically through the room, officially seizing the wedding gifts, the catering equipment, and the luxury vehicles parked outside as evidence of crimes committed with stolen funds. "No," Vivian screamed, her voice tearing completely at the seams. "No, no, no. The house, the cars, the country club." She realized it all at once. Every single designer gown, every piece of custom jewelry, the sprawling mansion in the gated community, the lavish society luncheons. Every single cent of her elite, untouchable lifestyle was funded entirely by federal fraud. The government was not just taking her husband. They were taking everything. The asset forfeiture would be absolute. She was going to be left with nothing. The socialite queen of the city was about to become a destitute, homeless pariah, stripped of the very wealth she had used to belittle others. Her eyes locked onto me. The realization that I was the only person in the room who actually possessed clean legal wealth hit her like a freight train. I was a legitimate billionaire. I was her only remaining lifeline. Vivian scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees. Her custom silk gown dragged through spilled champagne and ruined cake, but she did not care about her dignity anymore. She did not care about her wealthy friends watching in disgusted fascination. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around my legs and grabbing my ankles with a desperate, bruising grip. "Nia, please," Vivian sobbed, burying her tear-stained, mascara-streaked face into my shoes. "Please, you have to help me. I am your mother. I did not know what they were doing. I swear I did not know. You have to protect me. Please, I am begging you, have mercy." The man who had just cursed his own flesh and blood stared at me, his chest heaving under his rumpled tuxedo. The venom in his voice was meant to shatter me, to reduce me to the fragile, eager-to-please little girl who had spent her entire youth desperately craving his validation. He wanted to leave me with a wound that would never heal, a lingering poison, to ensure he retained some twisted psychological control, even as he was being hauled off to a federal penitentiary. But his words landed harmlessly, shattering against the armor I had spent the last 7 years meticulously forging. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not offer him the satisfaction of a single wavering emotion. I simply turned on my heel. My footsteps struck the polished marble with a steady, rhythmic finality as I walked toward the exit, the heavy silk of my tailored suit catching the fractured light of the chandeliers overhead. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath, the silence broken only by the sharp crackle of police radios and the rustle of tactical gear as the agents prepared to move him. I reached the grand threshold, the towering double doors that led out into the cool, dark Atlanta night. But I did not leave. Not yet. I stopped, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before turning slowly to look back over my shoulder. Marcus was still glaring at me, a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. "There is one last detail, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. I dropped the title of father. I stripped away the honorific of reverend. In that moment, he was nothing more than a common criminal, and I made sure my tone reflected his true status. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek, but he did not speak. He could not. The absolute authority in the room belonged entirely to me. "I know exactly what you and Vivian were planning to do with Big Mama's estate." I continued, watching the blood instantly drain from his already pale face. The mention of his mother, the woman whose genuine, unwavering faith he had exploited to build his corrupt empire, struck a nerve he could not hide. "You thought you were so clever. You knew the walls were closing in. You knew the federal indictments were inevitable, and you needed a massive, untraceable influx of cash to secure top-tier defense attorneys and post bail. So you looked at the only pure, untainted asset left in this family. You looked at the historic home Big Mama spent 40 years paying off with calloused hands and honest labor, and you quietly drew up the paperwork to leverage it to a commercial developer. You were going to let them bulldoze the legacy of your own mother to save your pathetic, fraudulent skin." A low collective murmur of disgust rippled through the remaining crowd of onlookers. Even the socialites who had participated in his corrupt ecosystem recoiled at the sheer, unadulterated greed of selling out a beloved matriarch's home. Marcus opened his mouth, his eyes darting frantically toward the federal agents trying to muster a defense, but I cut him off with surgical precision. "You do not need to worry about the developer's aggressive timeline anymore," I told him, allowing a slow, razor-sharp smile to finally touch my lips. 3 weeks ago, my legal team intercepted your quiet listing. I bought out the heavily leveraged shares you had secretly attached to the deed, utilizing a blind proxy corporation, so you would never see my name on the wire transfers. You gladly took the bait, assuming you had found a wealthy, ignorant buyer to fund your escape plan. I took one slow, deliberate step back toward him, ensuring the gravity of my next words crushed whatever lingering hope he possessed. "But I did not just buy it, Marcus. Yesterday morning, the moment the deed cleared, I legally transferred the entire property, the house, the land, and every single heirloom inside, into a protected, irrevocable historical trust. No." Marcus gasped, the word tearing from his throat in a ragged, panicked wheeze. He strained against the federal agents, his polished shoes slipping uselessly against the marble. "You cannot do that. That is my property. That is my inheritance." "It is untouchable," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unyielding finality. "You can never touch it. Vivian can never leverage it. Chloe can never use it as collateral for her luxury handbags. It cannot be sold. It cannot be mortgaged, and it cannot be seized by the government to pay off the millions of dollars you owe in federal restitution. The legacy of the ancestors who actually worked for what they had, the women who poured love and honest sweat into that soil, is permanently safe from your greed. You have absolutely nothing left to sell." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, the federal agents having to haul him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the floor. The arrogant, booming megachurch pastor was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, bankrupt shell of a man who had finally been stripped of his illusions. He had traded his soul for stolen prestige, and now he was going to face the cold, unforgiving reality of a concrete cell without a single dime to his name. "Take him out," I instructed the lead agent, my voice devoid of any lingering emotion. The tactical officer surged forward, marching my disgraced father through the grand lobby. From the side corridors, a secondary team of agents escorted a hysterical Vivian and a sobbing, ruined Chloe out toward the transport vans. They were flanked by federal marshals, their wrists bound, their designer clothes stained and wrinkled. As they were marched through the remaining crowd, the true nature of their elite high society friends revealed itself. The very people who had kissed their cheeks, drank their stolen champagne, and praised their holy empire earlier that evening did not look away out of respect. Instead, a sea of glowing screens illuminated the dim ballroom. Every former friend, every gossiping socialite, every wealthy investment banker raised their cell phones eagerly, capturing the Thomas family's ultimate humiliation. Camera flashes strobed violently, painting the room in harsh, unforgiving bursts of light, as the entire city rushed to record the downfall of the untouchable Reverend and his fraudulent kingdom. The Golden family was being marched out in absolute disgrace, their destruction broadcast in real time to the very world they had tried so desperately to conquer. The cool night air of Atlanta fades away, replaced by the ambient, quiet hum of my penthouse. The heavy crystal glass in my hand is cool to the touch, the amber liquid inside catching the soft golden light of the room. I take a slow, deliberate sip, sinking deeper into the plush cushions of my emerald velvet sofa. The city sprawls out beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering grid of power and motion. It has been exactly 18 months since that night at the country club. 18 months since I watched the empire of Reverend Marcus Thomas collapse into ash and ruin. The dust has finally settled, and the landscape of my life is completely unrecognizable from the one I was born into. The federal trial was the media spectacle that consumed the city for 6 grueling weeks. My father wore his clerical collar to court every single day, desperately attempting to play the role of the persecuted martyr. He used every ounce of his booming charisma, weeping on the stand, quoting scripture, and claiming that his financial discrepancies were the result of misguided faith rather than malicious intent. But forensic accounting does not care about charisma. The jury did not care about his sermons. They cared about the unyielding, undeniable paper trail of shell companies, offshore accounts, and wire transfers that my firm had meticulously mapped out for the prosecution. It took the jury exactly 2 hours to return a guilty verdict on all 34 counts of fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He went from commanding arenas of adoring thousands to living in an 8x10 concrete cell. There are no cameras there. There is no stage. He preaches to the iron bars now, a hollow, broken man, whose only congregation consists of inmates who could not care less about his stolen prestige. My mother did not fare much better. When the government initiated absolute asset forfeiture to pay back the millions my father had stolen from his investors and his congregation, Vivian lost everything. The sprawling mansion in the gated community was seized and auctioned off. The luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts, the custom jewelry, and the designer wardrobes were all liquidated by the state. She was left entirely destitute, forced to move into a cramped 400-square-foot studio apartment situated directly above a noisy commercial laundromat on the outskirts of the city. The most agonizing punishment for Vivian, however, was not the loss of her wealth. It was the complete and total eradication of her social standing. The high society matrons she had spent 2 decades ruling over dropped her instantly. When she attempted to show up at a charity luncheon 3 months after the trial, hoping to leverage her past connections, she was politely but firmly turned away by security at the front door. Her phone never rings. Her calendar is completely empty. She spends her days navigating the public transit system, counting her pennies at the grocery store, and living with the crushing realization that her worth was entirely tied to stolen money. Without it, she is completely invisible. And then there is Chloe, the golden child, the perfect daughter who believed her unearned privilege was a divine right. Preston Vance took a plea deal early in the investigation, eagerly throwing my father under the bus in a desperate attempt to reduce his own sentence. It did not save him. He still received 7 years for his role in the syndicate. The Vance name, once a pillar of old, untouchable money in this city, was dragged through the mud and permanently ruined. His aristocratic family immediately distanced themselves, cutting Preston off to salvage whatever assets they had left. Chloe filed for divorce the moment the indictments came down foolishly, believing she could sever her ties to the sinking ship and walk away clean. But she was listed as an officer on several of the fraudulent LLCs. While she managed to avoid prison time due to her sheer provable ignorance of the operational mechanics, she was held jointly liable for the massive financial penalties. Today, my radiant superior sister is working a minimum wage job as a sales associate at a mid-tier department store in the mall. She spends 40 hours a week on her feet, folding the exact same brands of clothing she used to buy with stolen funds. She has to smile and offer customer service to the very women she used to mock behind their backs. Her luxury lifestyle has been replaced by aching feet, a mountain of insurmountable debt, and the bitter reality of having to actually work for a living. Meanwhile, the deed to Big Mama's house sits securely in the vault of a protected historical trust. I hired a team of preservationists to restore the property to its original beauty. It stands as a community landmark, now a quiet, dignified testament to the women in my bloodline who worked with honest hands and possessed genuine faith. My parents can never touch it. They can never taint it again. I set my glass down on the marble coffee table, leaning forward as the camera slowly orbits, capturing the serene, absolute control I now possess over my own destiny. I look directly into the lens, no longer the quiet, overlooked daughter hiding in the shadows of a corrupt kingdom. They called me the family disgrace. They thought they could use me as their stepping stone and their punching bag. But revenge isn't just about destroying those who hurt you. It's about clearing the debris so you can build your own empire. To anyone out there who has been called a failure by the people who were supposed to love you, let them laugh, let them mock. Just keep building your arsenal in silence, because when it's your turn to speak, they won't have a choice but to listen.